There was a man once, just like you, just like me, who woke up every single morning with a silent promise perched on the edge of his tongue. He'd tell himself, "Today I'll finally hit the pavement for that run," or "Tonight I'll open that history book instead of the remote," or "This weekend I'll tackle that garage project." And for a few fleeting moments, standing there in the dim light of his kitchen, he'd feel a genuine surge of intention, a whisper of a different future. But then the day would grind on, the factory floor would hum its monotonous tune, and by the time he dragged himself home, that whispered promise would be drowned out by the louder, more insistent call of comfort. He wasn't lazy, not by a long shot. His body was a living testament to a lifetime of honest labor, his hands scarred maps of resilience. But somewhere in the space between aspiration and execution, a quiet chasm had formed. A persistent, widening gap where the man he hoped to be and the man he actually was drifted further and further apart. He kept waiting for motivation to strike him like lightning, to transform him overnight, never quite understanding that the real power lay not in the flash, but in the steady, relentless drip of disciplined choice. That man's name was Hector. 48 years old, carrying the kind of age that settles deep in the bones, pulling the shoulders down just a fraction more, making the morning groan a little louder. He worked at the sheet metal plant, a sprawling beast of steel and noise on the industrial outskirts of town. The air there was a permanent blend of cutting oil, hot metal, and the sweat of men pushing against the clock. His face, etched with the fine lines of countless sunrises and the deeper grooves of responsibility, rarely broke into a wide grin. His eyes, a tired but watchful brown, absorbed everything, giving little away. But it was his hands that truly told his story. Thick-knuckled, calloused, the skin permanently ingrained with the ghost of grease and grime. They were the hands of a provider, a fixer, a builder, hands that had hefted, hammered, and held things together for decades. Sometimes, though, when he caught them in a quiet moment unclenched, they seemed to carry the weight of more than just manual labor. A faint tremor, a memory of strain, hinted at a silent battle beneath the surface. His life ran on a familiar track. The 5 a.m. alarm, a jarring symphony against the quiet dawn. The same ritual. Shower, shave, the strong, dark pull of instant coffee. Before heading out, he'd often pause just for a moment by the bed where his wife, Alina, lay sleeping. 47, her face softer, less lined, a quiet counterpoint to his own weathered landscape. He'd press a gentle kiss to her temple, a silent reaffirmation of the vows they took almost 2 decades ago, a bedrock of their modest, well-maintained house. Built in the 70s, their single-story home in the working-class suburb was a beacon of quiet order. The lawn was always cut, the gutters clean, the paint touched up when needed. A testament to Hector's belief that a man's home reflected his character, even if the inside of his soul felt a bit cluttered. They had 2 kids. Sophia, at 16, was a whirlwind of teenage energy and burgeoning intellect, already showing glimpses of the quick wit Hector secretly admired. And Mateo, 12, all gangly limbs and the boundless, sometimes chaotic, curiosity of youth. They were his world, his reason to push through the long shifts, the quiet hum of purpose in his often monotonous days. Yet this deep love for them, this unwavering sense of duty, sometimes felt like another weight. He wanted more for them, something beyond the grind he knew. He yearned to show them that life held more than just getting by, but the example he set unintentionally was often one of quiet resignation. Hector was a reliable man, steady as a rock, the kind you could count on. He was observant, too, though he wouldn't interrupt to prove it. Get him comfortable, though, and that dry, quick wit would surface, a flash of unexpected humor that would leave you chuckling. But beneath that dependable exterior, a subtle battle raged. He was a man of good intentions, always planning to start exercising, to read more, to finally learn that basic coding skill he'd toyed with. Those history books piled beside his bed, the walking shoes gathering dust in the closet, they were monuments to his aspirations. But the factory floor drained him, body and spirit. After 10 hours of clanging metal and repetitive motion, the comfort of the worn armchair, the mindless flicker of the television, and the cool relief of a cheap beer became an almost irresistible siren song. He'd tell himself, tomorrow for sure, believing that motivation was a gift that would simply arrive, fully formed. But tomorrow always brought the same exhaustion, the same good intentions, and the same quiet, almost imperceptible surrender. He felt perpetually behind, a little defeated, stuck in a routine that felt less like a choice and more like a current carrying him along. There's a quiet truth most folks discover too late. that the life you want ain't out there waiting for some grand revelation. It's built, one weary brick at a time, in the small, unseen moments no one ever applauds. It's the difference between the man who dreams of a better life and the man who wakes up and starts laying that first brick, even when his back aches and his spirit drags. For too long, Hector had been the dreaming man, his hands idle, his spirit tethered to the familiar gravity of what was, rather than the elusive pull of what could be. He was caught in the subtle current of someday, a powerful river that carries away more ambitions than any grand flood ever could. Hector knew the ache. At 48 years old, he knew it in his bones, a dull, persistent throb that resonated from his feet up his spine. He worked the third shift at the old parts factory, a sprawling, grimy behemoth that had stood. He'd been there since he was 20, a silent witness to its slow decay, its stubborn refusal to die. His station, Line 7, was nestled deep within the cavernous space, a relentless symphony of clanking gears, whirring saws, and the metallic tang of machined steel. For 8 hours, his hands, thick and permanently etched with grease and fine lines, moved with an almost unconscious precision, inspecting, grinding, polishing the same small components. Each piece felt identical to the last, and the next, a ceaseless tide of identical parts flowing past him, each one a tiny increment of his life ticking away. The fluorescent lights hummed a tired, yellowish tune above, casting long shadows that swallowed the corners of the vast room, making it feel less like a workplace and more like a forgotten dream. When his shift finally bled into the pre-dawn gloom, he'd peel off his work gloves, the synthetic leather stiff and sweat-soaked, and make his way through the deserted parking lot. The old sedan, a trusty, dented gray Ford with too many miles, would cough to life, the familiar rumble a small comfort in the profound quiet. The drive home was a blur of empty streets, the rising sun painting the sky in bruised purples and faint oranges by the time he pulled into his driveway. Elena, his wife, a woman whose patience and quiet strength had anchored his world for 20 years, would already be up, the smell of coffee and stale bread usually hanging in the air. Sometimes she'd leave him a plate in the microwave, eggs, toast, something quick, often too tired to even taste it, just chew, swallow, fuel for the brief hours of sleep before the noise of the day began. Sophia, his 16-year-old with her mother's sharp eyes and a mind hungry for books, would still be asleep, buried under a pile of blankets, her school bag already packed by the door. Mateo, his 12-year-old, a whirlwind of energy and questions, would be tucked in too, dreaming of soccer goals and video game adventures. They were his world, his reason for every aching muscle and every weary sigh. But they were also the reason for the quiet dread that sometimes settled in his gut. The bills, forever migrating from the mailbox to the kitchen table, seemed to multiply. Tuition costs, sports fees, doctor visits, the constant hum of a modest existence barely keeping pace with the rising tide of necessity. He was a provider always. That was his unwritten contract with the world. But providing for Hector often meant just barely keeping his family's heads above water, not building them a stronger ship. He once harbored bigger ideas, had sketched out rough plans in the margins of old newspapers. Dreams of taking night classes at the community college, learning something new, something that didn't involve the rhythmic clatter of the factory floor. Maybe an electrician, or something with computers, a skill that promised more than a steady paycheck and a slowly deteriorating body. He'd even picked up a brochure once, the glossy paper promising a brighter future, tucked it away in the back of his desk drawer. It sat there, a silent reproach, slowly gathering dust, a forgotten ambition. Each time his gaze flickered toward that drawer, a wave of exhaustion or the immediate, undeniable demands of the present, a leaky faucet, Sophia needing new shoes, Mateo's growing appetite would wash over him, dousing the small flame of aspiration. He told himself, "No time, Hector. Too old for that now. What's the point in stirring things up?" But the truth, the raw, ugly truth he rarely allowed himself to voice, was a fear of failure, a deeper fear that he wasn't smart enough, capable enough, that he was simply meant for this life, this routine. That deep down, he lacked the grit, the discipline to pull himself out of the comfortable rut he'd dug. His biggest, most persistent demon wasn't external. It was the quiet voice in his head telling him to just settle, to accept, to not bother trying. The quiet ambition he carried, a heavy stone beneath his ribs, yearned for something more, not just for himself, but for his kids. He saw the spark in Sophia's eyes when she talked about books, the boundless energy in Mateo's every move. He yearned for them to have opportunities he never did, to escape the gravitational pull of just enough that defined his own life. But how could he teach them to reach for more if his own hands were tied by inaction, if his own spirit was content to merely tread water? That question, like a pebble perpetually lodged in his worn work boot, was always there, a constant reminder of the growing chasm between the man he was and the man he knew deep down he could, and perhaps should be. That question, like a pebble perpetually lodged in his worn work boot, was always there, a constant reminder of the growing chasm between the man he was and the man he knew deep down he could, and perhaps should be. The crack, when it finally appeared, wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic fault line. It was more like the slow, almost imperceptible widening of an existing crevice, until one day it just couldn't be ignored anymore. It started subtly in the yellow glow of Sophia's desk lamp. Hector found her slumped over her geometry textbook, her pen spinning idly between tired fingers. Crumbs of a half-eaten snack littered the page next to a half-finished equation. Her brow was furrowed, not with the concentration of deep thought, but with a weary, resigned frustration that Hector knew all too well. She looked up, caught his gaze, and offered a weak, apologetic smile. "It's just, I'll finish it tomorrow, Dad. I'm just so tired." Hector nodded, his own tired eyes seeing not just his daughter, but a reflection of himself in her posture, in her quiet surrender to the immediate comfort of delay. He saw his own stack of unread books, his neglected exercise shoes, his half-formed plans gathering dust in the back of his mind. The casual dismissal of a task, the deferral until tomorrow. It wasn't just a habit she was forming. It was one he was implicitly, unintentionally teaching. A quiet alarm bell began to toll somewhere deep inside him, a faint, insistent chime. Then, a few days later, came the second tremor. The factory floor was a symphony of industrial clamor, the shriek of metal on metal, the rhythmic thud of presses, the insistent hiss of hydraulics. Hector was wrestling a stubborn component into place on the assembly line, sweat stinging his eyes, when Juan, a kid barely out of trade school and still bright-eyed despite the grime, leaned against a stack of freshly milled parts nearby. Juan was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the cacophony. He looked up, a careless grin on his face. "Another Tuesday, huh, Hector?" he shouted over the din, not really waiting for an answer. "Just gotta get through the day, man. That's the trick." Clock in, clock out. Easy money. He snapped his gum, then went back to his phone. The words, meant as nothing more than idle chatter, hit Hector with the force of a physical blow. Just gotta get through the day. The phrase echoed in the roaring space, mocking him. Was that it? Was that the grand philosophy he was living by? Was just getting through the day the sum total of his aspirations? The image of Sophia's tired face, her unfinished homework, merged with Juan's blithe acceptance of mediocrity. A cold dread settled in his gut. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he was showing his kids, what he was subtly, perhaps irrevocably, embedding into their understanding of life. He realized with a sudden, painful clarity that he wasn't just living a life without discipline, he was teaching it, and the thought sickened him to his core. That night Hector couldn't sleep. He lay rigidly on his side of the bed, the familiar contours of the mattress suddenly feeling like a trap. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed a malevolent red. 3:17 a.m. Elena's breathing was soft and even beside him, a comforting rhythm that usually lulled him to sleep, but tonight it only amplified the stark, deafening silence of his own thoughts. He stared at the ceiling, at the faint patterns the street light cast through the blinds, each shadow an accusation. Just getting through the day. Juan's words, so casually tossed, now hammered at his skull. Is that what his life had become? A monotonous march from sunrise to sunset, a perpetual countdown to the weekend, only to repeat the cycle again. He felt the weight of his 48 years settle on him, not as wisdom, but as the crushing burden of squandered time. He saw the face of Sophia, her sweet, tired face, struggling with her homework, mirroring his own procrastination. He saw Mateo, full of boundless energy, soon to reach an age where he'd look for guidance, for an example. What kind of example was he truly setting? A man of good intentions, yes, but a man perpetually on the brink of starting, never quite doing. He turned over, punched his pillow, but the truth was relentless. He had let himself get comfortable in the rut, convincing himself it was a safe harbor. But in the cruel, honest light of 3 a.m., he saw it for what it was. A cage built not of steel bars, but of excuses, of not nows, of maybe tomorrows. He had buried his quiet ambition so deep, it had festered into resentment, a dull ache beneath his ribs. He wanted more for his kids, for Elena, even for himself. But how? How could he expect anything to change if he himself remained unchanged, stuck in the quicksand of his own making? He pictured the worn soles of his work boots, the calluses on his hands, the faint lines around his eyes. He worked hard, yes, but was he working smart? Was he working towards anything or just working? The question hung heavy in the pre-dawn air, unanswered, unforgiving. His biggest fear wasn't failure, he realized. It was living a life unlived. A quiet, crushing despair washed over him, a realization of the slow, insidious decay of potential. He was adrift, and he had been for years, pretending the current was leading him somewhere when in truth he was merely floating. He was adrift, and he had been for years, pretending the current was leading him somewhere when in truth he was merely floating. The despair didn't last forever. Even in the deepest shadows of night, a flicker of something else, stubborn and small, began to glow. It wasn't hope yet, not exactly. It was more like a spark of indignation, a quiet, furious whisper that said, "No, not this, not for them, not for him." He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a map, didn't have a plan. But in that silent, suffocating darkness, one thing became crystal clear, solid as a brick in his gut. This couldn't be it. This drifting, this waiting for motivation to strike like lightning, this endless cycle of good intentions and comfortable surrender, it was over. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, unshakable enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to picture a different Hector, a man who didn't just dream, but did. The image was blurry, distant. But the feeling of wanting it, of needing it, was sharp and immediate. He needed to be more than just the guy who punched the clock and then vanished into the couch. He needed to be the man who showed his kids that life wasn't just about getting by, but about building something, brick by painful brick, even when every fiber of your being screamed to stay put. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and when he finally drifted off, it wasn't into restless sleep, but a weary, determined slumber. The next morning, the alarm shrieked at 5:00 a.m. It was the same infernal sound it always was, pulling him from the shallow warmth of sleep into the cold, unforgiving reality of the early morning. His first instinctual thought, honed by decades of habit, was to smack the snooze button. Just 10 more minutes, just enough to cling to the fading echoes of a dream. But then a faint echo of that 3 a.m. reckoning whispered in his ear. Enough. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the battle already raging in his mind. The pillow was soft, the blankets were warm. His muscles ached a little from yesterday's shift, a familiar dull throb in his lower back. Every fiber of his being screamed for just a few more minutes of oblivion. His mind started to conjure excuses, smooth and well-worn. It's too early. You need the rest. What difference will 10 minutes make? But he remembered Sophia's frustrated sigh over her math book, the dismissive shrug of the young coworker. He remembered the quiet, crushing despair from hours before. This wasn't about feeling like it. He sure as hell didn't feel like it. This was about doing it anyway. With a groan that felt ancient and profound, Hector swung his legs over the side of the bed. The cold floor hit the soles of his feet like a jolt. He shivered, the goosebumps rising on his arms. He didn't jump up, didn't bound with newfound energy. He just moved, one foot then the other. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man moving through thick mud. He walked to the small, clear space in his bedroom, a spot usually reserved for discarded clothes or Alina's laundry basket. He stood there, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. What was he supposed to do again? Oh, right, stretch. He bent awkwardly, trying to touch his toes, feeling the tight pull in his hamstrings. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even comfortable. It felt ridiculous, a man his age in his underwear contorting himself like a rusty hinge. But he did it. He held the stretch for a count of 10, his breath ragged. Then he straightened up, feeling a faint click in his spine. He did a few more, a simple arm circle, a tentative side bend. 15 minutes, he'd told himself. Just 15 minutes. It felt like an hour. Then he walked to the worn armchair in the living room where he often slumped after dinner. On the small end table, he'd placed a book the night before, a biography of some old inventor, something he'd meant to read for months. He picked it up. The pages felt stiff, unfamiliar. He opened it to the bookmark. One page, just one page. His eyes were heavy. He reread the first sentence 3 times before it finally sunk in. His mind wandered, thinking about the factory, about the grocery list. He forced himself to focus, dragging his gaze across the lines of text. When he reached the bottom, he paused. He could easily read more, but the commitment was 1 page, and he had done it. He closed the book, placed it back on the table. The house was still quiet, the soft sounds of Alina and the kids sleeping drifting from their rooms. He felt no surge of triumph, no sudden burst of motivation, only a quiet, weary satisfaction. He hadn't wanted to do any of it. He hadn't felt like it for a second. but he had done it anyway. It was just a tiny, insignificant pebble in a vast ocean of routine, but for the first time in a long time, Hector felt like he had actually dropped something in the water instead of just watching the waves roll by. He padded to the kitchen, the familiar scent of stale coffee from yesterday's pot filling the air. He started the new pot, the gurgling sound a small comfort. Then, almost without thinking, he opened the fridge. He pulled out the bread, the cold cuts, the lettuce. He started making his lunch for the day. He didn't feel like it, but he did it anyway. Hector finished making his lunch, a simple ham and cheese sandwich, an apple, and a small bag of pretzels. He placed it in the fridge, a faint sense of something akin to victory, or at least compliance, settling over him. The next morning and the one after that were much the same. The alarm screamed at 5. His body protested. His mind conjured up vivid images of the warm bed, the soft pillow. He fought it. He got up. He stretched. He read one page. He packed his lunch. It wasn't a joy. It wasn't invigorating. It was just what he did. By the third morning, the initial nudge of novelty had completely worn off, replaced by a dull ache of obligation. Fatigue from the factory floor seemed to have settled deeper into his bones, and the idea of adding more to his already crowded schedule felt less like an investment and more like a cruel joke. The alarm, usually a nuisance, now felt like a personal enemy, a tiny, shrieking dictator demanding tribute. "What's the point, Hector?" The voice in his head whispered, sly and comforting. "You're still tired, still the same old grind, a page, a stretch. It ain't changing the world." He stared at the book on the table, the worn spine mocking him. Just one page. His eyes burned. He could just skip it today. No one would know. He could just roll back into bed, steal another precious 20 minutes. It felt like the most reasonable, most compassionate thing he could do for himself. His hand reached out not for the book, but for the alarm clock on the nightstand, intending to silence it and then just lie there. But then a flicker. A memory of Sophia slumped over her textbook last week, her pencil tapping a frustrated rhythm against the page, muttering, "I just can't focus, Dad." And the ghost of that younger coworker's glib comment, "Just getting through the day." Hector's hand paused, hovering over the snooze button like a bird unsure whether to land. Was this, just getting through the day? Was this what he was teaching them implicitly without a single word? That when it gets hard, you just give in. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He swung his legs out of bed. His feet hit the cold floor with a decisive thud. No, not today, maybe not ever again. He groaned as he bent to touch his toes, his back stiff, his hamstrings screaming. He kept going, counting the seconds, the small discomfort a welcome distraction from the louder voice in his head telling him to quit. He grabbed the book, opened it. His vision blurred for a moment, then sharpened. One page. He read it, word by painful word, each sentence a small act of defiance against the inertia that had defined too many of his mornings. A week later, the battle intensified. The initial burst of "I'm starting something new" energy had completely evaporated. Now it was just work, hard, unrewarding work. He didn't feel any stronger. He didn't feel any smarter. He just felt perpetually short on sleep. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift where a machine had broken down and he'd worked an extra 2 hours troubleshooting it, he came home utterly drained. Elena, seeing the dark circles under his eyes, suggested, "Why don't you just put your feet up tonight, me ammer? You look exhausted." The words were a siren song. The couch, the glowing screen, the blissful oblivion of a mindless sitcom. He deserved it. He'd earned it. He almost did it. He sat down, the remote in his hand. He even flipped past the news to a baseball game. But then he saw Mateo's backpack by the door, half open, a crumpled math worksheet spilling out. He remembered the feeling of being perpetually behind, always chasing, never quite catching up. He thought of Sophia and the subtle shift he wanted to embody for her. He sighed, a deep, bone-weary sound. He slowly got up from the couch, the remote clicking softly back into place. "I'm just gonna pack my lunch for tomorrow," he mumbled to Alina, who gave him a quizzical but understanding look. He walked into the kitchen, his shoulders slumping. He pulled out the bread, the cold cuts. His fingers felt clumsy, his mind foggy. He slapped the sandwich together, less care than usual, but he did it. The action itself was a tiny, almost invisible rebellion against his own exhaustion, a refusal to let the day dictate his next move. Then came day 14. This was the dark heart of the struggle. His body felt heavy, almost weighted down by an invisible force. He hadn't slept well, plagued by anxieties about a new production target at the plant. The alarm blared. He slammed his hand down on the snooze button. Once, twice. The third time, he just shut it off. He lay there, utterly defeated, the warm embrace of the mattress pulling him deeper into its false comfort. "See," The voice sneered, "I told you, you can't keep this up." "It's too much. Just be yourself, Hector. It's easier." He must have drifted off again because the next thing he knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. He bolted upright. 6:15, he'd overslept. Panic flared, he'd missed his stretches. He hadn't read his page. His lunch wasn't packed. He scrambled out of bed, feeling a wave of familiar shame wash over him. He was late for breakfast with the kids, late getting ready for work. The old Hector, the one always rushing, always behind, had returned with a vengeance. He stumbled into the kitchen, Mateo already at the table, pouring cereal. Sophia was still getting ready, but her school bag was by the door, neatly packed. Elena was calm, making coffee. The simple order of their morning, which he usually took for granted, now felt like a stark judgment. He saw the lunch bag Sophia had packed herself for school, a colorful container peeking out. He felt a profound sense of failure. He hadn't just slipped, he'd stopped. He was back where he started. He slumped into a chair, the warm mug of coffee doing little to thaw the cold knot in his stomach. He was about to tell Elena he'd just buy lunch at the factory, about to give up on this whole foolish endeavor. But then he looked at his hands, calloused and strong, hands that had built and repaired, that had held his babies, that had never truly given up on anything that mattered. And he looked at Sophia's bag, at the quiet, steady example she was unknowingly setting. "I'm late," he said, his voice raspy. "But I'm still gonna make my lunch. It'll only take a minute." Elena nodded, a small, knowing smile on her lips. It was clumsy. It was rushed. He almost forgot the apple, but he did it. He crammed it into a bag, feeling the lingering sting of his failure to wake up, but also a quiet, stubborn refusal to let that one mistake define the entire day or the rest of his life. He hadn't wanted to. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to just give up. But he did it anyway. And as he headed out the door, a faint flicker of that quiet momentum, almost extinguished, began to glow again. That day at the factory, the hastily made sandwich was nothing special, but he ate it. And in that simple act, a tiny seed of defiance against his own inertia took root. The next morning, the alarm still felt like a punch, but he got up. He stretched, stiffer than yesterday. He read a page, the words blurring, but he read them. And he packed his lunch, a little less rushed this time. Day after day, it was a quiet war against himself. The siren call of the warm bed, the tempting glow of the television after dinner, the familiar comfort of putting things off until tomorrow. He heard them all. Most days, he didn't want to do any of it. He felt tired, sometimes foolish, often like an imposter in his own disciplined routine. But he kept showing up, not because he felt motivated, but because he remembered Sophia's quiet struggle and that casual, careless comment from the younger guy at work. He remembered the dull ache of unfulfilled intentions, so he kept going. A page became 2, 5 minutes of stretching became 10. The packed lunch wasn't just practical, it was a badge of quiet victory. Around the third week, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden flash of enlightenment, but more like the sun finally breaking through a persistent fog. One morning, the alarm went off, and instead of dread, he felt readiness. A faint, almost imperceptible hum of energy. He found himself thinking about the book he was reading, eager to get to the next page. The stretches felt less like a chore and more like a gentle awakening of his muscles. Elena was the first to notice. "You've got a spring in your step, old man," she'd teased one morning, a genuine smile in her eyes. "Must be that new book of yours." He just grunted, but inside, a tiny spark of pride flickered. Later that week, Mateo, who usually had to be dragged out of bed, was up and ready before Hector even left for work. "Dad, can you help me with this science project tonight? You always have good ideas." Hector paused, a screwdriver still in his hand from fixing a wobbly chair leg. Before, he'd have mumbled something about being too tired. Now he found himself saying, "Sure thing, pal, we'll tackle it after dinner." The biggest change, though, was internal. The constant low hum of guilt and self-reproach that had been a permanent fixture in his mind began to fade. He started seeing the small, seemingly insignificant acts of discipline not as isolated tasks, but as building blocks. Each packed lunch, each early morning stretch, each page read was a brick laid in the foundation of something new. He wasn't just doing things, he was becoming someone. Someone who followed through, someone who could rely on himself. Weeks turned into a couple of months. Hector still worked the factory floor, the same grime, the same rhythm of machinery. His hands were still calloused, his back still ached sometimes. He was still the quiet, reliable Hector. But the quiet was different now. It was a settled quiet, not a resigned one. His eyes, though still carrying the weight of responsibilities, held a sharper, more alert glint. He walked with a purpose, his shoulders a little less slumped. He started noticing details at work he'd overlooked for years, subtle inefficiencies in the production line, better ways to maintain the machines. He even found himself offering suggestions to his foreman, not with grandiosity, but with a quiet confidence born of clear observation. His foreman, a man who rarely smiled, nodded thoughtfully, taking notes. At home, the shift was even more profound. He'd help Matteo finish that science project, not just with ideas, but with patient, hands-on work digging through old electronics in the garage for parts. Sophia, noticing her dad reading every night, sometimes joined him, curled up on the sofa with her own textbook, a silent companionship of learning that had never existed before. He was present, truly present. He wasn't just enduring the day, he was living it, shaping it. The fear of stagnation, that old, heavy weight, had been replaced by a quiet, steady current of momentum. He hadn't become a different man, not outwardly. But he saw the world, and more importantly, he saw himself with new eyes. He was no longer just getting by. He was building, brick by painful, purposeful brick, a life he actually wanted to live. Elena, his wife, was the first to speak it aloud. One evening after Matteo had gone to bed and Sophia was still reading, she found Hector at the kitchen table, not watching TV, but with a stack of community college brochures open, highlighting classes for industrial welding. He'd always wanted to learn. "You're different, Hector," she said, her voice soft, curious, a little awestruck. "You're lighter." He looked up, a small, genuine smile on his lips. "Just moving some things around, Elena." "Inside. Figuring out what I actually want to build outside." He wasn't always successful, not every day was a victory. There were mornings he hit snooze 3 times, feeling the old pull of the warm bed, the heavy blanket of inertia. There were evenings the textbook for his new welding class stayed closed, and the urge to just zone out in front of the TV was almost unbearable. But the difference wasn't the stumble, it was the getting up. The next morning he still stretched, even if it was a minute shorter. The next evening he still picked up the book, even if he only read half a page. The phone call for a project he was considering might be delayed a day, but it was no longer forgotten indefinitely. The internal monologue of defeat had been replaced by a quiet, persistent voice. "You made a commitment. Now do the next small thing, just the next thing." One cold Tuesday, the power went out at the factory. Complete shutdown. Chaos. People milling around, complaining, waiting for instructions. Hector, instead of joining the grumblers, walked to his toolbox, retrieved a flashlight, and started methodically checking the main breaker panel, something he'd learned about in a dusty old manual he'd been reading after his shift. He didn't fix it, that was the electrician's job, but he identified the general area of the problem, giving the foreman a solid head start when the pros finally arrived. His foreman, the man who never smiled, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good thinking, Hector. Real good." It wasn't about being the hero. It was about showing up prepared, ready to contribute instead of just waiting to be told what to do. That felt better than any raise. It was recognition of something deeper, of initiative, of caring. Later, sitting on the porch swing with Elena, watching the last of the sun bleed out of the sky, he tried to put words to it. "You know, all those years, I thought I just needed to feel motivated. Like some spark would hit me, and then I'd suddenly become the guy who wakes up early, who reads, who finishes things." He paused, a wry chuckle escaping him. "Truth is, most days that spark ain't coming. It's cold out there. My bed's warm. The couch looks pretty inviting." He looked at Elena, then out at the quiet street. "What I figured out, what really changed things, is that it ain't about feeling like doing it. Most days you won't. It's about deciding you're gonna do it anyway, no matter what, and then just doing the next small thing. Don't think about the whole marathon, just the next step. One page, one stretch, one packed lunch, and then the next day you do it again. A deep breath. Over time, Elena, all those small things, they add up. They add up to a life you actually want to live, not just one you're hoping for or wishing would just magically appear." He wasn't a guru, wasn't preaching, just sharing a truth he'd earned, one hard-fought morning at a time. And that's the thing about Hector and about men like him. They aren't born with fire in their bellies every single day. Nobody is, but some learn to light their own damn flame, a little bit at a time, every morning, every evening, whether the wind blows or the rain falls. They learn that the difference between